In the late 1800s, when colonialism was in full swing, British mining magnate Cecil Rhodes saw potential in a new untapped area of Africa for raw materials and precious metals that we now call Zimbabwe. But with the help of his venture, the British South African Company forced his way into the area, and over the next few years, tons of Englishmen flocked to the area. Because of that, in 1895, the area was officially named Rhodesia, which was not a country at the time, it was a corporate charter, but they named it after Cecil Rhodes, Rhodesia. And over the next few decades, nearly 230,000 English settlers poured into the region. But soon after this, because of that huge influx of Englishmen, tensions began to rise between the English settlers and the local inhabitants. Then, due to the rising population, in 1923, it was transitioned to a British colony, which caused tensions to rise even further because now the British Empire was now heavily involved in the government and local legislature. And over the next few decades, it continued to get more and more intense with more division, more rules and regulations that everyone disagreed on. And in the 1960s, the English Empire started to decolonize its territories to give back ownership and stewardship to the local populations. But after really intense and severe issues with Congo's independence from Belgium, a lot of the English government was worried about what would happen to them and their country if that transition of power went as poorly as it did in Congo. So because of all those fears and the rising tension over the last several decades, the predominantly English government declared independence, which means they completely separated themselves from the English Empire to become their own fully independent country. But this move was not recognized internationally, and only a few African countries supported the idea of Rhodesia's independence. And because of that independence and all that tension finally reaching a boiling point, several factions rose up to challenge this transition and the laws and regulations that were now imposed on them. And the three main factions being the Zapu, the Zanu, and the Zanla, which led to, in 1966, the first major clash between the Zanla guerrillas and the Rhodesian forces near the Zambezi River. Then, as the war heated up over the next few years, in 1970, Rhodesia declares itself a republic, severing remaining formal ties with Britain, which really poured gas on the fire, causing this conflict to really blow up and become this long, drawn-out war over the next several years between the Rhodesian police, Air Force, Army, and light infantry. They weren't just fighting against the locals anymore, because those different factions started to have backers from different countries and large organizations and governments to try to tip the scale in their favor, which included China and Russia. From these countries, they received training, weapons, equipment, and with the war in such a harsh environment with scorching deserts, high mountains, rivers, streams, thick African bush, both sides' gear would be put to the ultimate test. And as we've seen before, the gear that the individual soldier wears can be that tipping point of who would actually win the war. And we were lucky enough, with the help of Jim Green, to source an actual pair of bush war boots from that era, worn by arguably the most effective and elite soldiers of either side, worn by the Rhodesian light infantry and the Air Force. So we're going to dissect this boot piece by piece, cut it in half to see what specifically about this boot was designed to fight a war in one of the harshest environments any war has ever been fought in. What made this such an effective light infantry boot and Air Force boot? And finally, for the first time potentially ever, we get to see what's inside one of the most extremely rare boots in war history, and how they're built and why they built certain things certain ways based off the environment that these were intended to be used in. And I just want to know, would these still be an effective boot today? So now let's start going through the details, starting with the leather first, because this is an old boot, and yet this leather still feels like you could actually wear it. It's still malleable. You can see it's got some aging and some of that top coat is chunking off, but for the most part, these boots are still technically wearable. The leather's 2.3 millimeters thick, so about what you see in a work boot. We looked at the cross section, plenty of grain in there, and so this was a really high quality leather boot for the time, especially with all the issues of different countries not allowing imports and exports from Rhodesia at the time. It's kind of shocking that they were able to get away with such a high quality leather for the time. But what made this leather, I think, last so long is a lot of times this older leather, they required the soldiers to condition it, put dubbin wax and sealing wax over top, and that locks in the moisture over an extended period of time. It also makes them more waterproof and wear resistant for the actual war, but I think that's a big part of why this is in still decent condition today. But one of the most distinguishing features of this boot is this collar that has two straps and two buckles to secure the upper of the boot. And this is already an extremely tall boot for that area. If you ever know anything about desert boots, chukka boots, they originate from South Africa because it's so hot, they want a rugged boot, but they don't want the height. But the reason they put this big strap on, even for that hot environment, was for the paratroopers. It allowed them to tuck their pants in and securely fasten the boot around their ankle, giving them more support for when they hit the ground, supporting their ankle when they're hiking long distances through rugged terrain, because a lot of times these paratrooper troops are dropped in places that are going to be really hard to hike to, inaccessible areas, and so they're landing in areas that are not the most well-worn trails, and some of the thickest brush in the entire world is in that area. And so they needed a boot that would protect their legs, protect their feet, and we've seen this style of buckle across the board in several different wars in several different countries, and it seemed to be a really effective thing at the time. Eventually they were phased out because it caused issues with tangling on things. It was a little more cumbersome, a lot more leather needed to be used, and eventually a lot of boots got dropped to a lower height. But either way, it's a really cool and distinct feature of this boot. Then if we look on the inside of the boot, it's completely unlined through the entirety of the boot except for right at the very toe. And the reason they did this is so they could have a boot that they could wear in the hottest days and the coldest days. But honestly, more than anything, I think it was to save on materials, because the lining doesn't really affect the durability of the boot as much as the outer leather. Because this war was so unique and it was hard to get materials in and out, they only had so many materials at their disposal, and the little things that aren't needed for the durability of a boot, like the lining, gets omitted, except for right here in the toe. And this is one of the weirder things I've ever seen in a boot, because it's completely unlined until you see this toe stitch, and it stitches on what feels like a canvas lining. I kind of don't really understand why they would line it at all, you know, because that's going to give you a little bit of wear protection in the toe. It's going to give you a little structure in the toe, but I really don't know why they would only line it in the toe alone. So if you have any ideas, let me know. So you can see why this boot is so interesting and so unique, and it seems like it's shaped by the environment that this boot was built in, and for the war this boot was built in. Because if you look at the sole construction, once again, very, very simple, very versatile. You've got a full-length midsole that looks like rubber, and maybe another full-length slip sole, and this outsole is completely flat. And you know, you'd think for a war over so many different terrains, you'd want a more luggy outsole, but there are some benefits to more of this kind of crepe rubber outsole, because it's squishier than traditional lug soles. It's really, really flexible. It's really soft, so you get a lot of grip. And because it's flat, it wears down a lot slower than if you had a bunch of lugs throughout the boot. And where this boot, once again, you needed these to last a long time, but you need to make them affordable, it makes sense that they went with such a simple and flat sole. But it's still crazy to me to think of fighting a war in this slippery of an outsole. And one interesting thing is it's really a lot more quiet than other soles, which is a huge bonus for war. And even down to the footprint that these made, it was a lot harder to track these because it was a flat, soft sole. Really, the only indicator would be that print caused by the heel. And that was so effective that the SAS would sometimes resole their own pairs with flat soles, and they would even round the edge to not get a very firm footprint, so they're even harder to track. But there are cons, because it is a softer rubber. It's going to wear out faster than a really hard rubber. Over time, it can lead to splitting and cracking, but honestly, for this old boot, there's not any cracks or splits all the way through. It's still in really good condition. And this rubber is still pretty soft, because we did a durometer test on it. I'll just do one right here. It's still at 60 Chore. And so even down to the outsole choice, they were balancing the need of the war, but the capabilities they had and the resources available to make a war boot. And maybe the biggest part that made these affordable, quick to make, and ready for war is the way this boot is built. There's several different types of construction. You've got Goodyear welt that has several different components, several different stitches, a lot of points to fail, but really durable. You've got Blake stitch construction, where it's all turned to the inside, but it allows a lot of water and grit to get into the inside of the boot. There's cemented construction, there's direct injected construction, but you need big machines. It's a lot bigger of a process. So then how is this boot built? Well, this is a 360 stitch down construction. So it's more similar towards the Goodyear welt, where there's thread sewing things together. The way they build these is about as simple of a way as you can build a boot as possible. And what they do is they take the upper and they just flare it out, and then a stitch is sewn through the upper of the leather that's flared out, down through these midsole layers, and then the outsole is glued on. And what that does is it makes it really fast to make, because it's just a simple single line of stitching. It makes it really durable because you have glue and stitching holding things together. And with the outsole being glued on, you do have some potential delamination and it falling apart, but those threads on the bottom are protected by the outsole layer. So before you even start wearing through the main construction of the main stitch that holds this whole boot together, you have to wear out the outsole. And even then, if you wore through the thread, it's still not going to completely disintegrate, because a lot of times those layers clinch around the thread, creating a really strong bond. That's why in some of those really heavy duty boots, they sew through the outsole and you wear through it in a couple of days, but it's the actual pillar of thread sandwiched between all those layers that the layers collapse around, holding all of it together. So it's actually a brilliant way of making a war boot, especially for such harsh environments and with limited resources and without the backing of giant corporations and countries and fighting several different factions. You can see why this boot was so beloved by the soldiers in the Bush War. So now let's cut these things in half, see what's on the inside, how they structure it, and if there's any other little hidden details that no one's ever seen of what's inside a Bush War boot. We released our boot breaker insoles a couple months ago, and these are so popular. It's a really simple concept that just nobody had really done, which is just making an insole that's 2 millimeters thick to slide inside of your Heritage boots to make them just a little bit more comfortable, or when you're breaking in a pair of Heritage boots. That's the worst part of owning them. It takes like at least a month of honest wear to get a really high quality pair broken in. And these ease that a lot without changing your sizing, without really screwing anything up for the break-in except for adding a little bit of comfort. But after we did this, people were like, I want that, but out of leather. And I was like, we could do that. I already ordered the dies. And honestly, there's a lot of different ways you could use this. And part of it's just because people wanted it. So we were like, let's try it. Let's make it. Let's see what people come up with. Let's see what people do with it. But for me, there's a few different ways you could use this. One, if you have a pair of shoes or a different pair of boots and you want that heritage feel of a veg tan leather insole that breaks in the shape of your foot, use that custom contouring like this. See how that footprint? Or you could stack them. You could do like a leather on top, a boot breaker underneath. You could grab one of the really thick ones, put it inside a pair of boots that's way too big. It's gonna reduce that volume, make them fit a little bit better. So if you wanna add a little bit of that heritage quality to all your footwear or adjust your sizing or whatever, check out the leather boot breakers below. Let me know what you think, how you wanna use them, how you found ways to use them. Also check out our regular boot breakers, and thank you guys for supporting this, because this is what really helps fund cutting apart brand new stuff several times a week. So thank you guys, see ya. All right, we got it cut in half, but I only have one half because Jim Green sent these to us, and after getting them and talking, I was like, we should make a sample of these. Like, maybe people want to buy these. So if you do happen to want a pair of these, we might be doing a limited run of these. And the value of that is you're able to buy a little piece of history, because if we did make it, we would make it as close as humanly possible. So if you want to see that, just sign up for the email list below, because it's definitely not a 100% thing, but if we get enough interest, we might do it. And that's why I only have half a boot. So now let's see what's inside. So what do we have in here? Well, it's actually more simple than I even thought. And you can see that little toe lining, and there is a little bit of a toe stiffener behind it. Even in the counter, you've got a little bit of a stiffener. But what was interesting to me is it has a wooden shank, which is crazy to me. You would think for a war boot, you would want something stronger than a little piece of wood. But it's still gonna give some support. It's still gonna structure the boot and help bridge that gap and give you some arch support. But it's broken. So, obviously it's a several decades old boot, but it was broken when we opened it up. And I actually got a couple things wrong, because it is a rubber midsole, but I thought it was a dedicated internal insole, but this other leg on the outside is the insole. So it is about as simple of a stitch down construction as you can make. Because the leather's vital, because it's what you're standing on, it molds the shape of your foot, it doesn't wear out as fast, it doesn't stink as much, it doesn't mold. The midsole is what attaches that stitch down stitch, and then the outsole is glued to it. They've pared down every unnecessary bit to make these still an effective and efficient boot to make. So then what about this boot was specifically designed for one of the harshest environments, worn by some of the most elite soldiers of the war? Well, it is a very purpose-built boot. Everything that's unnecessary is completely removed, and there is function in every little piece that we've gone through. There's nothing on this boot that is just useless features, useless style things. Every inch of this boot was optimized for efficiency, effectiveness, and affordability. But also through those economic sanction issues with limited supplies of materials, limited resources, limited equipment, they needed boots that could withstand anything. And to do that, they kept all the most important parts, but beefed up everything else that mattered, like this collar, like the redundancy in the sole, like the crepe rubber outsole that gives several different points of value for the person wearing them, the absolute minimized lining just in the toe, the gusseted tongue. This boot really does balance the lightweightness, the ease of making, the ease of repair, the over redundancy of every element to make this the perfect boot for war. And under the circumstances, it's a pretty impressive boot that they pulled off. And this is probably the first time anyone's ever seen what's inside of these boots. And would this boot still be effective today? I think it would be. This is basically how Jim Green makes their boots. Jim Green boots have become really popular for the exact same reasons. It's not going to be nearly as comfortable as all the modern boots, but this would still be a really good boot across the board if someone released it today. But was this the best boot of the Bush War? Well, it's hard to say, because a lot of those different factions initially weren't backed by anybody, but over the years they got backed by Russia, where they received Russian gear. Same thing with China. So in order to really tell the rest of the story and really to understand if this was actually the best boot of the war, we need to tell the other side of the story and finish the history of the war. So if you know anybody that happens to have one of those boots from that era or have any connections, please help me out, because I think to really tell both sides of this story, we have to look at both sides and look at the footwear both sides were wearing. So stay tuned. Hopefully we'll be able to do the second half of this video if we can find one of those boots. And thank you guys for supporting these videos, because it's a really cool thing to be able to immortalize and tell the story of the individual soldier through the footwear they're actually using. Because this is one of these things that, you know, everyone knows about wars here and there, but this is a more obscure war, and it's really cool, and it's something special when these videos do well, because this isn't just a boot. People lived and died in these boots, and those stories are impactful to every human. So thank you guys for supporting these videos. If you don't mind, give us a like, give us a subscribe, share this video, because when these videos get like 20,000 views, it's such a bummer, but when they get millions of views, it's something really cool and special. So thank you guys for all your help. See ya.